Welcome back. It was only a brief minute, but hopefully you got a chance to enjoy Material Evolution's demo in the Startup Expo. And if you didn't, go check it out later. And this is our last main stage event. And I am so thrilled to welcome Ron Gonen, the founder and CEO of Closed Loop Partners up here, along with Lisa Mitchell. Lisa is our general manager for the Americas at Techstars, and she's a dear friend as well. I'll let you two take it away. Lisa, Ron, have fun.
Great. Thank you so much. And the reason that we're here with Ron is not only does he have a very interesting and storied past tied to this topic that you'll learn a little bit more about, but he also is an author of a brand new book. Ron, do you have your book?
I do, actually.
Okay, good. I want you to see The Waste-Free World. And so that's what we're here to talk about. Ron has absolutely an amazing past. He was CEO of a company called Recycle Bank back when I think we all didn't understand incentives tied to recycling, and he did. And I think fascinating after that, and before Closed Loop Partners, where he was the CEO, or is the CEO and founder, he was for a brief period of time the Deputy Commissioner of Sanitation and Recycling for the city of New York, for Mayor Bloomberg. And Ron, I just can't imagine that you didn't learn a whole bunch of stuff, I won't use any other word, tied to that role that you had in sanitation. You got really your hands dirty. Help us understand, what you learned about a waste-free world when you were there.
Mm-hmm. So getting invited to join the Bloomberg administration was an amazing opportunity. Mayor Bloomberg had been looking at the city budget and recognized that the city was paying close to $400 million a year exporting waste out of the city to landfills, and started wondering, are there any ways to cut this cost? It's exorbitant. There are so many things that we need to spend the money on. And unfortunately, the money's going to exporting waste to out-of-state landfills. And so I was brought into the administration to reimagine and rebuild the city sanitation department with a focus on recycling and circular economy. And a few things that I found. First is an amazing team of people working at New York City's Department of Sanitation. And so any listeners that are interested in public service, it's something I would highly recommend. I think you'd be very, very impressed with the type of people that you meet and get to work with. So that was the first thing that I noticed was I was going to be getting the opportunity to work with an amazing group of committed people. But the other thing that I realized that was going to be really critical is I could have all of the best ideas in terms of how to rebuild the city sanitation department. But if that wasn't coupled with a really strong and strategic communications plan, where I was able to get multi-stakeholders from all different parts of the city with all different interests, mostly aligned, the ideas wouldn't matter. And that was a really important lesson early on that I took to heart and hopefully did a good job implementing.
Yeah, and it seems like both in your previous work and now your work at Closed Loop, I mean, clearly you learned the importance of incentives and the importance of financial instruments. So talk to us about that, both at Closed Loop and kind of what you talk about in the book.
Yeah, so from my original introduction to the world of sustainability actually came while I was in high school, which is amazing for me to think now in the late 80s and early 90s. My first job in high school was actually working for one of the first green architects in America. And I wasn't doing any architectural work for him. I was just mowing his lawn and fixing the fence and babysitting his kids. But I got to hear him talking about what he was building and what his passion was. And it just seemed to make so much sense to me that you would try to build using the least amount of materials as possible. Try to design where you are able to operate with the least amount of energy as possible. It just made complete sense. I hadn't, so to speak, been polluted yet with the kind of conventional way of thinking about design in the United States. And so that was my introduction to sustainability. And that introduction came along with me just assuming that the smartest way to design and operate, especially from a business standpoint, was through the lens of sustainability. And so that's really my foundation, and everything I've done from being an entrepreneur to being a professor at Columbia to being in my role in the Bloomberg administration to now leading an investment firm has always been focused on this concrete belief that the way you maximize returns is by focusing on sustainable business practices.
Yeah, and obviously relative to the closed loop partners, I mean, you manage a venture fund, a growth fund, essentially project financing. So clearly you've come to the conclusion that you need multiple financial instruments. And I was just listening to the VC panel and hearing much of the same. Can you talk to us a little bit about your, what you see relative to how do we get to a waste-free world? Can we just do it with venture? Or do we have to have multiple instruments?
You're going to need multiple instruments. And I think if you look at any infrastructure that's ever been built in the United States, it required multiple instruments. And each one of those instruments is critical. And so as an investment firm that was founded with a focus on building out the circular economy, we were originally structured having multiple asset classes so that we could look at bottlenecks, find solutions, and then apply the right form of capital towards that solution to help it scale. And sometimes that requires early stage venture. Sometimes it requires infrastructure lending. Sometimes it requires PE, where we'll actually acquire a company and help it scale. It also requires a fair amount of discussions at the local, state, and federal level around public policy as well.
Yeah, and so let's touch on that, because clearly, we can have all the financial instruments in the world, but if we don't address some policy issues, and I remember listening to one of your podcasts, and you talked about in the sanitation department, you realized you were spending $180 million a year offshoring food.
Yeah.
And clearly, what kind of policy levers? Part of that, I'm guessing, is awareness. That we are all throwing away food and it's costing taxpayers $180 million. But what, as you look at a waste-free world, what are the different policy levers, and is it different at a federal level than a state level?
Sure. Well, one thing that I discuss in the book is a scam that unfortunately we've been subjected to for decades in the United States, which is this belief that we're living in a capitalist system that promotes a free market and the best product at the lowest cost is what always wins out. That's what we've been told. Behind the scenes, there's something very different going on, which is there's a lot of federal and state tax dollars used to subsidize certain industries. And unfortunately, those are industries that are not always aligned with our interest as consumers or taxpayers, nor are they actually healthy for society. And that's a scam that needs to be exposed and needs to be corrected. And that's something that I get into in the book. And a good example of that is the oil and gas industry. The oil and gas industry is the foundation of plastics. Plastics are made from petroleum. And what we've heard for decades in the recycling industry is, well, if recycled plastics were cheaper than virgin plastics, everyone would be buying them. And in America, we're all about the free market and all about capitalism. If you look behind the curtain, however, the fossil fuel industry, the oil and gas industry, has been the recipient of tens of billions of dollars annually for the last 50 years of federal and state taxpayer dollars. So the actual reason why virgin plastic is cheaper than recycled plastic is not because of capitalism or the free market or survival of the fittest. It's because the public unwittingly has been subsidizing virgin plastic production because the industry has been able to effectively lobby elected officials that should be supporting us. A great example of how that's been fixed in some instances is the solar and wind industry did a phenomenal job about 15, 20 years ago of going to Congress and saying, well, we're not going to get involved in the tax credits and subsidies that the oil and gas industry has. We don't want to get in that battle. They're really influential. All we want is to receive the same tax subsidies and tax credits as the oil and gas industry. And it was difficult for elected officials not to give them the same thing that the oil and gas industry gets. And what was interesting is once the policy was made uniform for all sources of energy, not surprisingly, solar and wind became much cheaper than the fossil fuel alternative.
And so how does the individual, I mean, you make a big point of policy. How does the individual even figure this out and pull it apart? Because it seems like a string that one has to pull to go all the way back to a state or local level and then a federal level.
Well, if we're talking specifically about policy, it's demand transparency. And what I mean by that is, where are my tax dollars going? Are my tax dollars being used to benefit me? And I'll give you an example of that in a conversation that's going on today with the infrastructure fund. The infrastructure fund is very focused at the moment on roads and bridges. There is a nice allocation for public transportation, which is good. However, it's a small part of the allocation. Most of the allocation is going to roads and bridges. But if you talk to most taxpayers about how would you like to get to work? Would you like to take a convenient bus or subway or train, or would you prefer to sit in your car for an hour in traffic? Most people would say, well, I would love to be able to access convenient public transportation. If that's what the majority of people say, plus you look at where the leading cause of death is in America, it's from auto accidents, and you put those two together, and you brought someone in that knew nothing about the history of the United States, you say, well, obviously elected officials are going to be using taxpayer dollars to mostly focus on public transportation. Most people don't want to sit in traffic, and actually driving a car is one of the most dangerous things you can do statistically. But then you look at what goes on, it's actually the reverse, is we're spending most of the infrastructure money on roads and bridges. And so I use that by way of example of demand transparency. Say, I want to understand how much is being spent sending waste to landfill. I want to know what that number is. I know it's in the billions of dollars, but it's embedded in my tax bill. And if we demand that transparency, we'll be able to start holding people more responsible.
And relative to transparency, one of the things that you talk in the book is, and it's funny, I'm wearing my Heritage Group jacket, a company that is funding a lot in the space of recycling. And there's a company, I think, that just pitched right before us called Material Evolution, that is a materials company looking at essentially reimagining how we create cement. To reduce all of the bad things that happen. So that takes us all the way back the supply chain. I mean, where should we be demanding transparency all the way back to materials? People don't know what things are made of,
right?
Especially when it comes to infrastructure.
Right. Well, I think if you start with two principles, one is the cost of disposal or the value of recycling a product or package needs to be the responsibility of the producer. So if you are a manufacturer or consumer brand and you put something out into the market that is not easily recyclable or doesn't really have much of a market in the recycling industry and has to go to landfill, that's not a cost that the public should be responsible for. And that's how our system operates today. That's a cost that you should be responsible for. You sold that product, you made a profit. The cost of disposing of it should not be a cost borne by the public. Now, on the flip side, if you're a brand that puts out a product or a package that's easily recyclable, creates a lot of local jobs in the recycling industry, the municipality makes money selling it into the recycling industry, you should be rewarded for that. Similarly, in the case of something like a concrete, helping people understand via transparency, this is what's actually in the product and how it relates to your health will enable people to make decisions about, oh, yeah, I understand it's cheaper, but it could potentially have these health consequences on me and my family. So yeah, not interested. It's not a price question anymore. The best example of that is I think you see the growth of companies like Seventh Generation and Method cleaning products, where they were really the first to come to market and say, we're going to disclose what we're using in our cleaning products and guarantee you that it's healthy for your family. And originally, people thought that there was a ceiling to those products because they're a little bit more expensive. Yep. There's a ceiling to those products to just kind of the green consumer. And those analyses were completely wrong. Those businesses continue to grow exponentially every year because whether a family is Republican or Democrat, live in a red state, a blue state, believe in climate change, don't believe in climate change, when they go to the supermarket and they have a choice between a product that won't disclose what's in the product or won't tell you about the health implications of what's in the product. And over here, you have a product that's practicing complete disclosure and guaranteeing that everything that's in there is healthy for your family. It doesn't matter what your political persuasion is or where you live. You're going to gravitate towards that product. And that's why forcing transparency on the system is really the core part of the solution.
And can you talk a little bit more? I mean, method is a great example, but you talk a lot in your book about raw materials and the supply chain. And ultimately, the supply chain, I think I took out of it, the supply chain is the problem. It is the solution and the problem.
Yeah. Well,
and what are you seeing with, I mean, that's a big problem for a giant company to suddenly switch their supply chain.
Well, the global supply chain that exists today exists because of an economic incentives that are no longer existent on the market. So the reason why we have global supply chains today is back in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, into the 80s, it was much less expensive to manufacture in Asia, especially Southeast Asia, South America, Africa, and transportation costs were far cheaper than they are today. And so we built these massive complex supply chains because there's an economic incentive to do so. Even though the supply chain was complex and it had multiple touch points, you were still saving money over manufacturing locally. That's changed. Standard of living has risen in those parts of the world, meaning labor costs have gone up. At the same time, transportation costs have gone up. And so now, from an economic standpoint, it actually doesn't make sense anymore to have these global supply chains. It's just those supply chains have become so embedded in how we did business, even though economically it maybe didn't make sense anymore. And more critically, had tremendous risk embedded in it, which is what we saw in COVID, where one crisis hit and all of a sudden the supply chain started to crack. It had become so bloated, so complex, so embedded in the way we did business that nobody was able to say, let's take a step back here. It's time to unwind this and rebuild supply chains based on what we know today about how we're living today and we'll live in the future. And that's a lot of what the circular economy is focused on doing, is unwinding those supply chains that have become bloated, complex, risky, costly, to and create supply chains that are more focused on local manufacturing, resiliency, and an economic system that actually reduce costs.
Yeah, and so what do you think that the entrepreneurs that are on here that are, trying to change concrete, material science companies in the fashion industry that are creating materials that, can decompose, how do those companies early stage companies convince global companies that could be their strategic partners to take something like this on? Should they not waste their time with people who haven't self-selected into, I'm Unilever, I'm Patagonia, et cetera? What's your advice?
It's a great question, because there's nothing harder in business than starting a business and growing a business.
Yes.
And if there was one easy answer to that question, I would probably, as an entrepreneur, bottle that answer and sell it as a product. So the first way I'll answer that question is just a recognition and a congratulations to everyone out in the audience who has started a company, is trying to start a company and grow that company. What you're trying to do is very challenging, and you get a lot of credit for just doing it, because it's something that a lot of people in business just never have the courage to try and do. A couple of things that I've learned along the way that I found to be keys to success in entrepreneurship and growing businesses. And this gets back to my comment actually about something that was very helpful when I went into government. Communication, understanding who your stakeholders are. Your business is not about you or your ego or how it might change the world. Your business is about why it's in the best personal interest of the person you're speaking to buy your product or partner with you.
Right.
And it's really, really important to digest that and make that a part of your DNA as an entrepreneur and a company. When you're sitting across the table from somebody, it's about them. And they have their own personal reasons as to why they're going to say yes to something or no to something. And that comes into how they earn their salary, how they get a bonus, how they get promoted, how they may get fired for trying to be too innovative or breaking the mold. You really need to understand the paradigm in which that decision maker that you're meeting with at that moment in time is operating under, and design your messaging to try to trigger them to view their buying from you or partnering with you as in their best interest.
And Ron, you use an example that is the best example I've ever heard in my life, tied to rats. And I think it's amazing. It's an amazing example of, convincing people that a technology that is gonna, well, you tell them.
Yeah.
I know we're
yeah, it's a good story. So when we decided to roll out a curbside organics program in New York City, I knew that it would require multiple stakeholders to approve the program. We had multiple city council members that had to approve the program. You had community boards that had to approve the program, so on and so forth. And the one thing that I knew that all New Yorkers could align on is we don't like rats. We don't like rats. And when it's trash day and the bags are outside, we have rats in New York City. New York City is the best city in the world. I love living here, but we need to be honest that we got rats. And the reason why we have rats is New York City is an older city. We don't have containerized garbage collection. The garbage, which is mostly food waste, is sitting out on the curb, and it's an amazing opportunity for rats. Rats probably come from all over the world when they hear about how we dispose of our garbage in bags on the curb. And so I learned that in the city, we had a professional ratologist. Yes, that title actually exists. We had a professional ratologist. And I went to him and said, what would happen if we took all of the food waste out of the garbage bags and we put them in special containerized organics bins that were 2 inches off the ground with wheels and a special lid? What would happen to the rat population? He said, well, I can answer that right away. The rat population would decrease significantly. Rats smell downward, not upward. And if they can't smell the food in these containerized containers, they'll stop breeding and the rat population would go way down. And so when we presented the curbside organics programs to community boards, rather than saying, this is a great way to reduce the effects of climate change, or this is good for the environment, we said, this is a great way to reduce the rat population in New York City. And we got an exuberant yes to the curbside organics program.
And it's such a perfect example of storytelling, public policy, using an entrepreneurial approach in terms of these containers that had probably not been used before at a very local level.
Yeah.
It's an amazing story of how to get to a waste-free world. Is there a parting thought that you have for us that's like the biggest lesson from the book that we can find in the book?
Demand transparency from the companies you want to buy products from and the people that you elect to office. And I think that if we all focus on transparency as being the core tenet, the market will work more effectively for us as citizens.
Okay, and when you say demand transparency, you mean start at the local level.
The local level, the state level, the federal level is let us know what are in the products and packaging that are on the shelves. Let us know how much it's costing to get rid of it, and forcing that transparency, not just in consumer products and packaging, but in all parts of life, but specifically in consumer products and packaging, will create a system that'll be much more equitable and much more prosperous for us as citizens and consumers.
And as the founder and CEO of Closed Loop, how do you influence that? And I'm assuming it's called, because Cody's gonna pull me here, that I'm assuming that the influence is you put your money where your mouth is.
Yeah, I started an investment firm and raised a series of funds based on this philosophy. And the great thing about doing that is it's introduced me to some phenomenal entrepreneurs around the world. And that's a great validation that what you're thinking about is going on, actually is going on, because you end up meeting all these phenomenal entrepreneurs that are developing unique solutions.
Yeah. So everybody read Ron's book, Waste Free World, and let's help us get there.